In this stage, we're going to create materials for our scene. So we left off the assembly of the scene from the previous video. So everything else is actually, we can see that the pivot point is all in the right place, and all the objects actually separated modular assets that we can actually repeat use later on. Now what we're going to do is actually we are going to create new materials, and by importing all the textures that we actually created previously, and we'll create the two materials which consists of the two texture islands we're going to use for the whole scene. And let's go ahead and create the materials and also import the texture now. To observe first, let's explain a bit about the default shader. So this is a default shader that actually was created in the beginning of the when you import all this asset, right? You see here there's a asset 01D, there's a room 01D, but there's no texture to it. So what actually this thing is actually is a default shader. So this is a default shader which is actually cannot change at the moment. Okay, so we need to create a new shader which is something looks like this, and we can actually put in the textures that we actually created from Photoshop. You can check again there's two type of shader now. This one is the room 01D and one is the asset. Okay, so when you click on it, you choose, you shows the shaders, okay, the default shader. But before we actually create any shaders, we have to import the texture first. So what we do is actually what I did was actually I created a new folder. Okay, so this folder is, you can name it as a textures. Go. We have this kind of shade folder. It's good to organize all the images inside. For example, here I imported all the images here from that Photoshop that we created in the previous lessons that we used for the final scene in Sketchfab. So all these diffuse, bump map, normal, specular of the two texture islands, we can reuse them in Unity. So what you need to do, right, is just simply after you created the folder to organize things, you just select all the images, right, that you have created and just throw and just import inside. And the ones import, it takes a while. Import texture. So once I have imported all the texture, this is how it looks like. And the next thing is we want to create materials. Okay, we want to create materials. So say example of the final material I created. So I'm going to create them from scratch again for you to see. Before that, we also need to be organized in our work. So one of the few things is we actually can create folders to contain our assets. So the materials and texture, we should try to avoid being putting together with all the meshes, because it can be very chaotic if there's a lot of meshes going around. So after you create the materials, right, okay, you go into the folder, you right click and go to create material. And once in this one, you can see there's a standard material being created. We're gonna put this one as the room 01_M. So what it means, M is actually material, the name for material. So this will be the master shader for the room. So once I created the shader, this is something that we can see the name here, and then from here we can actually change the shader. So what we do now is actually we're gonna put in the textures that we imported into this shader. So the first thing I want to change is actually currently the shader, this one, right, is using shader. Okay, and you can see there's a lot of version of shaders that you can choose, and most of the time you can actually look at some of the guidelines of what kind of materials you should be using, what kind of shader you should be using. There's even legacy shader from the past. Okay, then for standard, there's actually two types: standard, specular setup, and standard normal. So this will actually change the difference between these two. So we'll go there in a while. Rendering mode, we'll just keep it to opaque. Cutout is for, like, let's say we have a lot of transparency or cutout of alpha cuts that we don't use. Fade is actually very transparent also. Transparent itself is another option of transparent. So by default, looking at here is actually it's pretty obvious that it's either object with no transparency or object with transparency for the other three category. So this one we're going to choose opaque. So what we need to do now is actually this textures object, we're going to assign this shader. So at the moment, this one is we want to assign the right shader, room 01_D. So here you see that this is not the right one. So what you can do is just drag this one into, once you assign the room_materials, right, so we actually can double click this one to go to the shader. Now in this shader, we actually can start assigning these things like diffuse textures and the specular texture and also the normal texture. So if you see the picture here, this is actually empty at the moment, so you can click on the small little button, small circle here. It will go to the select texture option. Over here you can see that all the textures that actually you imported into the scene, right? And you can actually see what texture we can choose. So over here we know this is actually a room, so we have the room diffuse texture. So once you click on this one, it will replace the slot here, and you can see the albedo is using this texture. Okay, so this is the diffuse texture. So next thing, we can close this one and we can go to the metallic. Now for the metallic one is actually the specular texture. So when we choose the specular texture, you'll get something like that, and it might not be very nice because this texture is actually not purposely being used for, let's say, this kind of shader. This is more towards PBR, which is metallic smoothness. And we can change this into specular option by going to the standard here, and we change another specular setup shader instead. So when we choose this one, right, the shader is a bit different, and you will see that this metallic change to specularity, okay, specular texture, and then we can change the smoothness. And with smoothness, we actually can have a very, let's say, decent startup with the shader. And the next thing we need to do is actually now we can choose normal map. So when we choose normal map, we choose the normal map from the room, and you can see this is the normal intensity, and then we can adjust the intensity from here. So just you can drag the slider here to decrease the intensity. Sometimes a little bit of normal will be okay already. Then I will probably tone down the specularity to match it. But at the moment here, you see, even though I try to adjust this, the specularity looks simply just strange. So in my previous lesson, I mentioned about in times in the industry when I was trying to fix this problem, right, I usually will try to save enough textures by not using a specular. But let's try using a specular texture and see what happens here. So it actually still works, but at the same time, this specular is just too white color, so we can actually see what happens here. So you need to see whether this specular is something that you want to use for. Most times I will suggest, right, for myself, if you find this specularity is black and white and still issues, right, you will probably just slot in the same diffuse texture by itself, then we have a more vibrant color specular. So this is something that I actually find out I can use, right. Then you see the color itself is more vibrant instead. Because there's an option that we actually go to Photoshop and adjust the specular textures to be a bit more color, which we can see we can explore that later on. So now with this color, I'm going to keep something like this at the moment. This setup will actually be just nice, 0.3. I'll probably put the specularity at 0.3. So once I've done this, the setup, right, the rest of this is actually I can keep it to empty at the moment because I do not have these textures for all these slots. But this is just a basic setup, and it's good enough for doing any project. Now with this specular going on, the next thing we're going to do is actually just go and assign all this, right, with the shader. So you can actually just click on here. When you click on this object here, click on this button here, you can actually choose the shader you had just created. So when you go and choose, right, all the previous object, they'll assign to another shader, and you can actually change it to the correct shader. So then over here, all this stuff here, we can change to _m. Either that, or you can just drag the shader into it. So even this one also, I think probably you can just use this. Even you can choose this option like drag this way, or you can choose it to drag from here, to change from here. So two options for you to choose. So now this is actually the room _m. So once I've done this, the room setup was done. I can turn on the lighting again and you can see it's probably working already, right? With a nice specular, with nice normal map, and all the specularity and the normal map starts to appear already. So this is probably something acceptable at the moment. Okay, the next small thing we should actually do is the second material here. So we're going to create another material. So go into materials, and then with this one we'll call it asset _m. Over now, this one also the same thing. We do the same setup, and we put the albedo to the asset, and then the specularity I can just choose the same one, and then this one, the specular setup, I'll just probably change it to something similar like the previous one, the previous room 0.3. So it's actually using 0.3. Okay, so around that 0.3, you can type a norm number. Then I'll put a normal map. This one I'll just put at 0.5. So once I set out this one, I can actually now assign the, let's say, the table to this asset. Okay, so I can choose asset 0 and M. Can I get the table done? Okay, so this is the table with all the setup done, and I can actually just choose all the asset and just drag this one into the slots here. So that's also another option. So sometimes, depending on which one is more convenient to you, and just go ahead and assign all this here. So same for the rest of the object. So once now you actually see that this shader room_m and also asset mi is actually being created, and this is the type of shaders that you can use in any scenes. And what we can do with is that adjusting further, okay, with the color, the normal map, and we want to get something that is actually more suitable. So a lot of times we can actually tweak until something we get. At this moment, we probably want to have a very minimal normal map for this shader. It could be go negative or positive. So a lot of times we just try to get minimal effect without being too exaggerated on the results. And also this time, all this other actually will help in the end. But probably this is the most simple setup you can do for any games, and it's probably the most cheapest now. If I will go cheaper, I probably will just turn off the normal map instead. Then there's another option there for a lot of mobile games. We do not have even specular and normal map. Just a simple diffuse texture with lighting that will be done. And most of the time you see here the specularity, most of the time you want to save memory. Usually you just will slot in the same albedo texture. So because that way, the specular still have the same kind of result or same kind of specularity, even though is supposed to do shiny, a little bit shiny effect, but it still works. Okay, you can choose go to 0 and see the effect. Sometimes a bit minimal is okay already, not a lot. That's the purpose of specularity. So over here now, probably this one looks okay at the moment. I'm gonna put back the normal map. The normal map, even I want to go even minimal for this kind of assets. You see that just push a little bit, it's okay already. So not too much, gives a little bit of normal map specularity. Okay, the next thing is I'll now go ahead and do fast forward and assign all the asset with the right shader, and I'll come back to you, show you the final result. Alright, now I actually assign all the dashes to the shaders to all the asset. The next thing I actually notice from the previous exercise, we actually have the glow effect on the window, right? So for this one, we actually can try doing the glow effect. But usually we just want to create a new shader with this. But let's check if we use emissive here, what will happen in emissive emission here. So we've used emissive, we have the color here. And then what we can do, we can choose this one, and then you see here that it's glowing already. Then over here now, this dasher, we actually can assign, maybe check whether we can actually change the color here. When you click on this one, you'll change the color of the HDR here to something that you can actually have some lighting, and we actually can push the intensity here. So you can actually play around the intensity and push kind of the kind of lighting you like to achieve with this result. There's even two different options here for what you want to achieve. So probably I'll just get something, try out something like this first at the moment, and probably red, maybe yellow color is looks pretty much okay, but let's get something a bit more down and maybe push the color a bit brighter. Okay, so once you do have this, it looks something like a glow already. So this is how you do emissive textures, emissive material. So now we're gonna stop over here, and the next session we're gonna do lighting to further create more depth and more high fidelity to the scene.